The bikers met an old seamstress closing her shop. One jacket brought her story back. "Please, Mr. Cobb, don't lock the door today. I only need one more afternoon to pack 40 years into boxes." Eleanor Stanton's voice cracked as she stood with $11.36 in loose bills and quarters folded inside a torn envelope. Her worn black shoes powdered gray at the toes, her fingers speckled with old needle marks and fresh thread dust. Sterling Cobb held the ceiling notice inches from her face and told her the shop would be posted, emptied, and turned over before 5 p.m. If she could not pay the so-called regional planning fee. Then the back door opened, steel-toed boots struck the old wood floor, a long shadow cut across the storage room, and the smell of engine oil rolled in, before Sullivan Crow Adler said a single word. Eleanor turned so fast her shoulder brushed a leaning mannequin, and the thing rocked against a stack of mold-flecked fabric bolts, before settling crookedly against the fabric. The storage room behind Stanton Tailoring was barely 12 feet wide, packed tight with rusted pin patterns, yellowed order tags, cardboard boxes, and cloth rolls that had absorbed decades of dust. Outside the narrow glass pane, a dust storm pressed against the building hard enough to dull the daylight into a brown haze, and wind whistled through a gap under the back door like a kettle that would not stop. Eleanor coughed into the inside of her wrist, then steadied herself against the edge of a cutting table scarred by 40 years of scissors. She looked small beside the table. She was not weak. Sterling Cobb, clean white shirt tucked tight, polished shoes planted like he owned the floor already, glanced at Crow and frowned as if the biker were another piece of junk Eleanor had failed to remove. Crow was 55, broad in the shoulders, white, bald-headed, with a thick gray beard and dark tattoos climbing his neck and covering his throat. Instead of black leather, he wore a faded denim jacket stained, with grease at the cuffs and ripped open near the left shoulder, the tear running 4 inches along the seam like something old had finally given way. He carried himself with the heavy stillness of a Hell's Angel who had learned long ago that power did not have to hurry. Eleanor saw the tattoos first, then the oil stains, then the hard set of his jaw, and fear flickered across her tired face. Crow noticed. He lowered the jacket onto the cutting table with both hands, careful not to scatter the pins, and looked her in the eye instead of crowding her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough from road dust. "I was told you can save seams other people give up on." Sterling gave a sharp laugh and slapped the ceiling notice against the table. The paper jumped. "She can't save herself," he said. "This property is under action. Regional planning compliance. Outstanding fee. Immediate closure." Eleanor's mouth tightened, but she did not argue. Her eyes moved to the old sewing machine beside the wall, a black metal machine with a worn gold decal and a foot pedal polished by thousands of hours of work. Crow followed her glance. The machine mattered. Sterling saw it too, and his face hardened with impatience. "Pack the antique," he snapped, "or leave it for disposal." The word disposal landed harder than the wind outside. Eleanor reached for the machine with both hands, not because it was worth money, but because it had outlasted rent hikes, roof leaks, and every winter the town forgot the old shops on the side street. Crow remained still, but his attention sharpened. In the dim room, among the moldy cloth and the sound of dust rasping against glass, he looked down at the notice Sterling had brought, then at the fake clean edges of the paper, then at the blank space, where an official court mark should have been. He did not speak yet. He just placed 2 thick fingers on the corner of the notice and held it flat. Crow kept 2 fingers on the corner of the notice, not hard enough to tear it, just firm enough to make Sterling Cobb understand the paper was not going anywhere yet. The wind pushed dust through the gap under the back door and dragged it in a thin gray line across the floorboards, past Eleanor's worn shoes, past the fallen threads, past a cardboard box labeled Winter Alterations in pencil that had faded almost to nothing. The room smelled of damp cloth, old starch, rusted pins, and the sour mold that lived inside fabric left too long against brick. Every breath scraped a little. Eleanor reached for a rag from the cutting table, not to clean the room, but to wipe the dust off the faceplate of the old sewing machine, as if it could still hear insult. Her fingers trembled around the rag, each knuckle swollen, from years of hemming cuffs, replacing zippers, and pulling heavy denim through needles that snapped if you rushed them. On the wall behind her, paper patterns curled from their hooks, some held together by pins gone orange with rust, and 3 old mannequins leaned in the dimness like quiet witnesses. One had a cracked shoulder. One had no stand. The smallest one was still adult-sized, marked with chalk lines across the chest for a suit alteration from years ago. Sterling glanced at them with disgust. "This is exactly what I mean," he said, tapping the notice with one clean fingernail. "Obsolete inventory, unsafe storage, no modern commercial value. The district is changing, Mrs. Stanton. It changed because men like you priced out the people who kept it alive," Eleanor said, but the sentence cost her. She coughed once into her sleeve, dry and sharp, then pressed her palm against the table until it passed. Crow's eyes moved to the lower door gap. Without making a show of it, he lifted one 40-pound bolt of brown wool from the floor, set it against the draft, and nudged it into place with the side of his boot. The draft weakened. Not much. Enough. Eleanor looked at him then, really looked, past the shaved head and tattooed throat, past the grease stains on his denim jacket, past the kind of silence that made most people step backward. Crow had lowered his stance beside the table, shoulders still wide, hands visible but busy, with the paper not raised like a performance. He was not asking her to trust him. He was giving her time to breathe. "I've had this shop 40 years, Eleanor said, voice low now, almost embarrassed by the size of the number. "I opened it with a used machine, a rent deposit of $480, and 2 racks of thread bought on credit. I hemmed work pants for pipe fitters, took in funeral suits for widowers, patched canvas jackets for roofers, shortened Sunday dresses for grown women who were too proud to ask twice. Nothing fancy, just work." Crow nodded once, and his eyes dropped to the measuring tape curled near his hand, a yellow 60-inch tape, with the black numbers rubbed pale between 28 and 34. Sterling rolled his shoulders under his pressed shirt. Sentiment does not satisfy a compliance fee. The paper in Crow's grip shifted slightly, as the fan of dust under the door found another crack. Eleanor opened a drawer and pulled out a ledger with a split spine, the pages swollen at the corners from humidity. "I paid rent through the end of the month," she said. "I paid business tax in April. I paid the fire inspection fee in March." Sterling's mouth tightened. "This is separate." "Separate from what?" Crow asked. His voice did not rise, but it filled the room in a way the storm could not swallow. Sterling looked at him like he had forgotten the biker could speak. "From planning," he snapped. "From redevelopment. From fees she ignored." Crow glanced at Eleanor. "Did he mail notice certified?" Eleanor shook her head. "He slid it under the front door yesterday at 6:20 p.m. I found it beside the dust mat." Crow looked back down at the paper, at the 2 clean seal graphic printed in the corner, at the missing file stamp, at the blank line, where an authorized signature should have been. Sterling reached for it. Crow did not move fast. He simply flattened the page again, with 2 fingers, calm as a man holding down a pattern, before the first cut. "Before you close a woman's shop," he said, "you ought to bring a real order." Sterling stared at Crow for 3 hard seconds, and the only sound in the room was the wind worrying the back door and the soft scrape of grit moving under the brown wool bolt. Then he snatched the notice back just enough to wrinkle the corner, but not enough to free it from Crow's fingers. "You don't know what you're looking at," he said. "This is a private lease matter." Crow's tattooed throat shifted as he swallowed whatever answer first came to him. He kept it down. Eleanor saw that restraint, and somehow it frightened her less than Sterling's clean shoes did. Sterling turned his anger toward her, because that was easier. He stepped around the cutting table, lifted a cardboard box with both hands, and dumped its contents into another half-packed crate without looking. Spools rolled across the floor, buttons scattered under the table, and a paper sleeve of size 18 denim needles slid into the dust. Eleanor bent to catch them, but her knees stalled halfway down. "Please," she said, not loudly, just worn thin. "Those are sorted." "Then sort them somewhere else," Sterling snapped. He grabbed the edge of the old sewing machine's wooden table, and jerked it aside to clear the wall behind it for his imaginary seal. The machine lurched. Its black metal head tipped toward the floor, the belt slipped, and before Eleanor could reach it, the whole thing dropped hard onto the boards, with a sound like a heavy bell losing its voice. The impact cracked the old pedal bracket and sent a snapped needle skittering 6 feet across the floor. Eleanor froze. No scream came out, only breath. Crow moved 1 step, and the room changed around him. His boots planted wide, his shoulders filled the narrow aisle, and the oil-dark tear in his denim jacket opened against his left shoulder as his arm tightened. Sterling flinched back before Crow touched him, but Crow did not touch him. He did not raise a fist. He did not curse. He bent down slowly, picked up the broken needle between 2 thick fingers, and laid it on the cutting table beside the notice. That was worse. That machine has been here longer than half the buildings on this block, Eleanor whispered. She knelt beside it, with 1 hand on the floor and 1 hand on the machine's chipped gold decal. My husband bought it used, from a tailor in Fresno in 1984. It stitched the first curtains I ever sold. It stitched every black suit I hemmed when men in this town had to bury someone they loved. It never asked me if I was too old. Her palm stayed on the machine, as if she could keep its history from leaking out through the cracked bracket. Sterling wiped dust off his sleeve, irritated, not sorry. It was blocking access. It was not, Crow said. 2 words. They landed flat and heavy. Sterling's face tightened into something meaner than a smile, a hard little crease at one corner of his mouth. You bikers think a jacket and a stare make you witnesses to everything. Crow looked at him then, steady and close enough that Sterling had to see the ink across his throat, but not close enough to threaten. I am a witness to paper, Crow said. He picked up the notice again and turned it toward the dim light. Dust moved over the glass behind him in brown sheets, hiding the sun, until the room looked almost evening dark, though it was still afternoon. Eleanor pushed herself up, with the edge of the table, breathing through the smell of moldy cloth and warm grit. Her eyes went from the machine to Crow's torn jacket, and for the first time she seemed to understand why he had come. The left shoulder seam had not simply ripped, it had failed along an old repair, the kind done by hand, when someone cared more about saving the garment than making it pretty. Crow saw her looking and touched the torn edge with his thumb. My brother wore this, he said. Not blood brother. Road brother. He passed last spring at 62. Heart gave out in a truck stop parking lot outside Bakersfield. Adult man, lived rough, loved quiet. This was the last thing he left with me. Eleanor's face softened, but Sterling cut in before the silence could become human. Touching, still irrelevant. Crow looked down at the ceiling notice, then at the crooked printed emblem in the corner, then at the blank signature line. He placed the broken needle directly under that empty space. No, he said. This is where it starts matching. Crow slid the broken needle a half-inch to the left, lining it up under the empty signature line like a pointer on a blueprint. I spent 19 years framing buildings, pulling permits, and waiting in county offices with dust in my beard, he said. A shutdown order has a trail. This has a costume. Sterling's jaw shifted. You are not qualified to interpret commercial documents. Maybe not all of them, Crow said, but I know what a missing file stamp looks like. Eleanor stood behind the cutting table, 1 hand pressed to her ribs, where the cough had settled, the other resting on the dented edge of her old machine. She looked from Crow's shaved head to the ink wrapping his throat, then to the faded denim jacket lying across her table, and confusion passed across her face. In her world, men who looked like Crow brought noise, bills, and trouble through the front door. This one was reading margins. Crow did not miss the look, but he did not shame her for it. He reached for the yellow measuring tape, pulled 12 inches straight across the paper, and tapped the upper right corner, where a seal graphic sat too high and too clean, printed in the same black ink as the body text. Official seals don't drift like cheap clip art, he said, and they don't come without a clerk mark, case number, or issuing office. Sterling stepped closer, face flushed now in the dim brown light. Give me that notice. Not until Mrs. Stanton has a copy, Crow said. He took out his phone, its cracked screen catching a dull stripe of light from the dusty window and photographed the full page, then the corner seal, then the blank signature line. Each photo saved, onto the cracked screen, small but permanent inside the packed room. Sterling's hand shot out toward the phone, then stopped when Crow shifted one boot back, keeping distance without giving ground. No shove, no threat, just space. Eleanor pulled in a careful breath. The smell of moldy cloth, hot dust, and machine oil pressed around them, as Crow turned the paper over and read the back. Blank. He looked at Sterling. You served this yesterday at 6:20 p.m. by sliding it under her door. No certified mail. No posted response period. No court signature. No county file number. Yet you told a 71-year-old tenant she had, until 5 today, to leave a business she paid rent on, through the month. Sterling let out a hard little breath, through his nose. The redevelopment office authorizes management to enforce compliance. Which office? Crow asked. Sterling's eyes darted once to Eleanor's ledger, then back to the notice. Regional Planning Coordination. That's not an issuing authority. That's a phrase. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the table edge, and a small thread of hope moved through her face, so cautiously it barely changed her expression. Crow opened the camera again and photographed the invoice Sterling had brought, the one demanding $2,875.00 for a regional planning fee due immediately. He zoomed in on the payment instructions. The name on the receiving account did not match any city office, county treasurer, or court clerk. It matched a private management account. Crow turned the screen toward Eleanor first, not Sterling. Did you ever receive this fee from the city? Eleanor shook her head. Never. I got my usual rent statement, my business license renewal, and the fire inspection receipt. Nothing else. Show me the fire receipt. Eleanor pulled open a lower drawer and removed a manila envelope tied with string. Her hands shook, but she knew exactly where to look. Inside were rent receipts, business tax papers, and a fire inspection slip stamped March 14th, paid $96.00, signed by an inspector named Russell Ambery, an adult city employee whose name Crow only read from the paper and did not need in the room. Crow laid the real receipt beside Sterling's notice. The difference was obvious even in the bad light. Stamp, number, office, signature, date, contact line. That, Crow said, tapping the receipt once, is what official paper looks like. Sterling's collar had begun to darken, with sweat despite the dry air. You're making assumptions. Crow lifted the fake notice again and held it between them, flat and steady. No. I'm asking the question you keep dodging. The wind struck the back door hard enough to rattle the latch, and dust whispered across the floor around the old sewing machine. Crow's voice stayed low. Which court signed this? Sterling did not answer the question. He adjusted his cuff instead, a small polished motion that looked ridiculous in a room full of dust, broken thread, and a 71-year-old woman's machine lying wounded on the floor. You are interfering with a lawful property action, he said, but the words came too fast, and the last one scraped thin. Crow watched him the way an old builder watched a cracked load-bearing beam, not with panic, but with calculation. Then he turned away from Sterling entirely and faced Eleanor. Ma'am, before this man decides what you are allowed to keep, I need to know something about this jacket. Eleanor blinked, still caught between fear and disbelief, but her eyes dropped to the faded denim spread across the cutting table. The left shoulder was torn open near an old hand repair, for inches of seam pulled loose, the fabric darkened by years of road oil and sun, the collar rubbed nearly white, where a neck had worn it down mile after mile. She touched the edge with 2 fingers. Her hands knew before her mind caught up. This was fixed before, she said quietly. Not with a factory machine. Somebody used a backstitch here, tight and uneven, but strong. Whoever did it wanted it to last. Crow's face changed, so slightly most people would have missed it. Eleanor did not. She had spent 40 years reading people by the way they stood during fittings, by the way grown men held their breath when old suits did not close, by the way women watched mirrors when life had made them tired. His name was Callum Pike, Crow said. White man, 62, when his heart gave out last spring. He rode with us longer than most folks stay married. He patched this himself outside Bakersfield, with a motel sewing kit and bad light, because he said throwing away a good jacket was a sin against the road. His thumb pressed the torn shoulder, not lovingly in a soft way, but carefully, the way a man touched the last solid thing left from someone who mattered. Eleanor swallowed. Sterling's face tightened with disgust. "We are not holding a memorial over laundry." Crow looked at him once. That was enough. Sterling looked away first, but kept his chin lifted, sweating now along the hairline, where dust had begun to cling. Eleanor reached for a spool of heavy gray thread from the scattered mess on the floor, then stopped when her knee stiffened. Crow bent before she could ask, picked up the spool, the fallen sleeve of size 18 denim needles, and 3 black buttons, placing each item on the table in a neat row. He did it without ceremony. That made it kinder. "The shoulder needs a patch inside," Eleanor said, voice steadier when she spoke about work. "Canvas would hold better than lining cloth. The stitch has to carry tension, not just look clean. If I rush it, it will tear again the first time you lift your arm." "Then don't rush it," Crow said. Sterling slapped his palm on the table, making the cracked phone screen flash beside the fake notice. "She is not performing services in a space under closure." "You still haven't shown the closure," Crow said. He reached into the inside pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a folded money clip, thick but plain, held by a scratched silver band. He counted bills onto the table slowly, 20s, 10s, then a 50 that made Eleanor's eyes sharpen with protest. "No," she said. "A repair like this is maybe $35. $45 if I reinforce the inside." Crow kept counting until $180 lay beside the torn jacket. "You are not charging for thread," he said. "You are charging for 40 years of hands that know what thread can do." The words hit Eleanor harder than Sterling's threats because they did not sound like pity. They sounded like a receipt for something the world had stopped pricing correctly. She looked at the old machine on the floor, then at the fake notice, then at the jacket that had carried grief through road dust and sun. The room stayed close around them, 12 feet of crowded fabric and rusted pins, wind hissing under the door, daylight still brown behind the glass. But Eleanor's shoulders came up a fraction. Sterling saw it and grew sharper. "If she takes that money," he said, pointing at the bills, "she is conducting business after notice. I will add penalties." Crow picked up the phone, opened the photos of the blank signature line and private payment account, then laid the screen beside the $180. "And if you keep pretending that paper is real," he said, "you will be explaining why your fee goes to a management account instead of a public office." Eleanor drew the jacket toward her, slow and deliberate, as if pulling one life back across the table, while another tried to steal hers. "I can mend this," she said. "I know," Crow answered. Sterling's finger hovered over the bills, then pulled back, as if the money itself had burned him. "You are both creating a record of unauthorized business activity," he said, but his voice had lost its clean edge, and the dust clinging to his damp collar made him look less like a man in charge, and more like a man trapped in his own paperwork. Crow did not answer right away. He turned the fake invoice toward him and read every line slowly, letting the silence stretch, until even Eleanor could hear Sterling breathing through his nose. The wind scraped grit against the glass behind the storage room, and the brown wool bolt at the door gap trembled every time a hard gust pushed under it. The room held its breath. Crow tapped the payment box printed at the bottom of the invoice. "This says $2,875 due to Cobb Property Management by cashier's check or money order. Not the county treasurer, not the city clerk, not a public planning office. Your private account." Sterling's jaw worked, but nothing came out. Eleanor stood behind the table, with Crow's torn denim jacket under one hand and her old ledger under the other, her needle-marked fingers spread across the split cover like she was holding down her own history. "He said if I paid by noon, he could stop the seal," she whispered. "He said if I waited, the fee doubled." Crow's eyes lifted to Sterling. "Convenient." Sterling snapped his head toward Eleanor. "You misunderstood a standard compliance conversation." She understood enough to have $11.36 in an envelope in a shop full of boxes, Crow said. He opened the photo gallery on his phone and placed the screen flat on the cutting table. One photo showed the blank signature line. Another showed the fake seal. Another showed the private payment instructions. He swiped with one thumb, careful and slow, each image catching the dim light like evidence laid out under a shop lamp. Eleanor glanced at the phone, then at the man holding it. For the first time, the shaved head and throat tattoos did not look like danger to her. They looked like armor somebody had learned to wear after hard roads. Crow slid the real fire inspection receipt beside the invoice again, aligning the edges. Here's a real municipal receipt. Office name, date, contact number, employee signature, receipt number, and the amount paid. $96. He nudged Sterling's invoice with the edge of the 60-inch tape. Here's yours. No filing address. No appeal period. No public office. No hearing date. No court mark. And a private account demanding almost $3,000 from a 71-year-old seamstress during a dust storm. Sterling's face tightened red under the fine powder on his skin. You keep saying court. This is not an eviction. This is administrative enforcement. Then show the administrative authority, Crow said. Show the ordinance. Show the notice period. Show the agency letterhead that can be traced by phone before close of business. Eleanor opened the manila envelope further, pulling out rent receipts one by one, some printed, some carbon copies, some folded so many times the creases had gone soft. March rent, April rent, May rent, business license, fire inspection, a receipt for window repair after a winter windstorm, $214.70, paid in 2 installments. Proof had weight. Sterling reached toward the pile, as if to shuffle it, but Eleanor moved first. She placed both palms over the papers, not fast, not dramatic, just firm. No, she said. One small word. Crow's beard shifted, as he almost smiled, but he kept his eyes on Sterling. He took his phone back and opened a blank email draft. The cracked screen showed the subject line, suspected improper commercial closure notice and private fee demand. Sterling saw it. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the dry air, catching tiny grains of dust until they stuck there like ash. You have no idea who to send that to, he said. Crow's thumb moved across the screen. State Planning Board. Real Estate Licensing Division. City Commercial Code Office. I don't need to know everything. I just need to send the paper to people who do. Sterling gave a short, ugly laugh that broke halfway through. You think a denim jacket and a few pictures make you some kind of investigator? Crow leaned closer only enough for Sterling to hear him under the wind, his boots still planted, his hands still visible, his voice still even. No, I think fake paper hates daylight. Eleanor looked down at the torn shoulder seam beneath her fingers, then at her fallen sewing machine, then at the open email on Crow's phone. The shop was still crowded, still dusty, still one bad signature away from vanishing. But the fake fee had started coming apart thread by thread. Crow's thumb hovered over the send icon, and Sterling Cobb's breath changed. It came shorter now, shallow through his nose, as if the crowded storage room had finally become too small for the story he had been telling. Eleanor saw it, from behind the cutting table, saw the man, who had walked in, with a fake seal and polished shoes suddenly watching a cracked phone like it was a judge's bench. The wind hit the back door again, rattling the latch, and dust sifted down from the top of an old shelf, where folded muslin had been stacked since the Clinton years. Crow did not send the email yet. He gave Sterling one clean chance to step back. You can state for Mrs. Stanton, clearly, whether this paper came from a court, a public planning office, or your own printer, he said. Sterling's eyes flicked toward the fake notice, toward the $180 on the table, toward Eleanor's ledger under her steady palms. This is harassment, Sterling said, but the word shook. From a customer? Crow asked. From a tenant asking for proof? Sterling's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. You have no standing. Maybe not, Crow said. But she does. She paid rent through the month. She has receipts. She has a business license. She has a paid fire inspection dated March 14th. And now she has photos of a closure notice, with no court mark, no agency contact, no valid signature, and payment directions to your management account. He turned the phone, so Eleanor could see the email draft. not as a performance for Sterling, but as a courtesy to the woman whose shop was on the line. Do you want me to send it? Eleanor stared at the screen. Her glasses had slipped low on her nose, and fine dust had gathered in the creases around her eyes. For 40 years she had said yes to rushed hems, unpaid favors, late pickups, landlords who promised repairs next month, and customers who wanted skilled hands at bargain prices. This yes was different. It was not surrender. Send it, she said. Crow pressed the screen. The message sent, and the confirmation appeared on the cracked screen, almost too small for what it carried. Sterling lurched half a step forward, then stopped himself, both hands curling at his sides like he had reached the end of a leash. Delete that, he said. No, Crow answered. One word. The phone battery showed 16%, and Crow slid it into his jacket pocket, as carefully as he had placed the broken needle on the table. Sterling tried to recover his authority by snatching the fake notice from the cutting table, but his fingers fumbled against the paper edge. He folded it once, badly, then again, crushing the corner with the printed seal. Eleanor did not flinch this time. She watched him. Crow watched the door. You think an email scares me? Sterling said, voice climbing too high. No, Crow said. I think a licensing board does. I think a state planning office asking why a private manager is collecting a fake regional fee does. I think a 71-year-old business owner with dated receipts and photographs scares you plenty. Sweat ran from Sterling's temple to his jaw, cutting a clean line through the dust stuck to his skin. He looked suddenly older, not by years, but by exposure. The room had become evidence. The torn notice, the real receipt, the fallen machine, the $2,875 demand, the woman with needle-marked hands who had been told to disappear before 5 p.m. Sterling pulled a folder from his briefcase and shoved the remaining papers inside, with jerky, angry movements. This matter is paused pending review, he said, trying to make retreat sound official. Eleanor's voice came from behind the table, thin but level. Paused by whom? Sterling glared at her, but he had no answer that would survive the room. He tore the fake notice once across the middle, then again, dropping the pieces into his briefcase instead of the trash, because even torn paper could talk. Crow's eye stayed on him. The photos are already gone, he said. Sterling's polished shoes scraped backward through thread dust and grit. At the door, he turned as if to say something final, but the wind shoved a ribbon of dust across his cuffs and stole the moment from him. He left without slamming the door. That made it smaller. Eleanor stood very still after he was gone, both palms flat on the ledger, the torn denim jacket under her right wrist, the old machine lying at her feet. Outside, the storm kept grinding against the glass, but inside the 12-foot room, something had shifted. Not safety yet. Proof. Eleanor did not move until Crow bent beside the fallen sewing machine and looked up at her instead of touching it first. May I? He asked. The question was simple, but it gave the machine back to her before his hands ever reached it. Eleanor nodded once, and Crow lifted the black metal head with both palms, careful around the cracked pedal bracket and the bent needle plate. It was heavier than it looked, nearly 30 pounds of old iron and memory, and when he set it on the cutting table, the legs groaned under the weight. Still standing, Eleanor wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, then seemed embarrassed by it, and reached for the clean rag Crow had used to gather the needles. The belt slipped, she said, her voice returning to the practical shape of work. The bracket is cracked, but not broken through. I have spare needles in the second drawer, if you didn't scatter them all. Crow crouched and collected what Sterling had dumped. Buttons, chalk nubs, bobbins, a torn paper packet of snaps, and the sleeve of size 18 denim needles now dusted gray. He laid them out by type, because he had watched old mechanics do the same, with bolts, and respect sometimes meant sorting what another man had tried to ruin. The wind outside stayed mean, scraping sand against the back glass, but the wool bolts still blocked the worst of the draft. The room remained tight and dim. It felt less helpless. Eleanor checked the machine by hand first, turning the wheel a quarter inch, then another, listening for the catch. The belt dragged against the wheel, slipped, then settled back into the groove. She drew a breath, threaded the needle, threw the eye on the second try, and Crow pretended not to notice that her hand shook. He picked up the torn denim jacket and turned it so the damaged shoulder faced her. The oil stain near the cuff left a dark mark on the table paper, and the old road dust in the seams smelled faintly of gasoline, sun-baked cotton, and the kind of miles that never made it onto maps. Eleanor touched the torn repair again, then reached into a lower drawer for a scrap of canvas, deep charcoal and stiff enough to hold tension. "Inside patch," she said, 2 inches wider than the tear. "Anything less is decoration." Crow nodded. "Do it right." She measured the patch with the yellow 60-inch tape, trimmed it with 8-inch shears, and pinned it under the shoulder seam, with 6 straight pins that flashed dull silver in the brown light. Crow stood on the other side of the table, not hovering, just blocking the narrow path to the door, with his broad frame and grease-stained denim, as if the room itself deserved a moment without being invaded. Eleanor lowered the presser foot. The first stitch sounded rough. The second held. Then the machine began moving in a low, uneven mechanical rhythm, drawing heavy gray thread through the old jacket one line at a time. Eleanor's face changed while she worked. The fear did not vanish, and neither did the rent, or the inspection papers, or the threat of Sterling finding another way to press her. But her eyes sharpened behind her glasses, and her shoulders remembered the posture of a woman who had made a living by getting things through tight places without tearing them. Crow watched the needle rise and fall through Callum Pike's jacket, and his throat worked once beneath the tattoos. He hated new clothes, he said quietly. Said new denim had no manners. Eleanor almost smiled. He was right. The little sound that came from Crow was not quite a laugh, but it warmed the dust between them. Eleanor reinforced the shoulder with 2 rows, then a third across the stress point, each pass steady enough to outlast weather and road vibration. When she finished, she clipped the thread close with tiny snips and rubbed the seam flat with her thumb. "Lift your arm before you pay me," she said. Crow slipped into the jacket slowly, careful with the mended shoulder, and raised his left arm to chest height, then higher. The seam held. Eleanor looked at it, not pleased with herself exactly, but present again in her own shop. Crow placed the $180 closer to her ledger and added another 20 without a word. She started to object. He shook his head once. "For the machine trouble he caused," he said. Eleanor looked at the money, the real receipts, the old machine, and the stitched jacket now whole enough to ride again. Outside, dust kept beating the glass, but inside, the needle was threaded, the proof was sent, and the shop had not closed. Eleanor did not count the money at first. She placed it under the real fire inspection receipt, weighted both with her brass pin cushion, and looked toward the front of the shop, as if she expected Sterling Cobb to come back through the door with another paper costume in his hand. He did not. Only the storm pressed against the glass, dragging dust along the storefront hard enough to make the old window hum in its frame. Crow checked his phone once, saw the sent email marked delivered, and an automated intake reply from the state licensing division stamped 3:47 p.m. Then turned the screen toward Eleanor so she could read it herself. "It is not a verdict," he said. "It is a record." Eleanor nodded, and that seemed to matter more to her than any promise he could have made. She took a clean carbon sheet from a drawer, wrote the intake number in her careful slanted hand, and tucked it beside the rent receipts, the business license renewal, and the March 14th inspection slip. Her hands still shook, but now they shook while doing work. Crow knelt beside the old sewing machine again and checked the cracked pedal bracket with his thumb. "You will need a new bracket," he said. 3 screws, probably 1/4 inch. The frame held. Eleanor gave a tired little breath that almost became a laugh. "So did I?" Crow looked up at her, and for a moment the hard road in his face softened without losing its shape. He helped her lift the machine back onto its table, not like a rescue, but like 2 workers moving something that had earned respect. The belt sat crooked, then settled when Eleanor turned the wheel. The needle rose. The needle fell. Across the room, the fake closure had left no mark on the door because Sterling had never had the authority to place it there. Eleanor walked to the front counter, each step careful, over spools and grit, and took down the cardboard note she had written that morning with a dull pencil. Closing today. She held it for a second, then folded it once and set it beneath the counter instead of throwing it away. Some days needed witnesses too. Crow pulled his repaired denim jacket across his shoulders. The mended seam held when he reached for the door handle, and the patch inside did not pull, not even when he rolled his left shoulder against the weight of the fabric. He laid one last 20 on the counter, separate from the repair money. For a new needle plate, he said. Eleanor started to refuse, but he was already stepping back, bald head lowered slightly under the narrow doorway, throat tattoos disappearing into the shadow of the collar. Bring it back, if the seam fails, she said. Crow paused with his steel-toed boot on the threshold. It will not. The dust storm outside had weakened to a low brown drift, and a strip of muted honey-colored light reached across the wooden floor, touching the old machine, the ledger, the patched jacket, and Eleanor's needle-marked hands as she sat down again. Crow stepped out into the grit. The door eased shut behind him, and inside the small back room, the sewing machine kept moving in a steady rhythm, while dust slid down the glass in thin, fading lines. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.